I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
Charles did not speak when the message reached him. He read the first page, turned to the second, and then placed the papers flat on the table, as though touching them had suddenly become unbearable. The Supreme Court had revealed something the palace had feared, but never expected to confront publicly. Documents supporting Prince Harry's hidden succession claim had been exposed as forged. And buried inside the judgment was a detail that made the king's silence terrifying. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stared at Harry's name again, almost as if reading it twice might change what stood beneath it. The Supreme Court judgment, the formal decision issued by the country's highest court, did not merely question one disputed page. It exposed forged material connected to a concealed attempt to strengthen Harry's position within the line of succession, the legal order determining who inherits the crown. That mattered, because succession depends on trust in authentic records, lawful authority, and an unbroken chain of evidence. If false papers could enter that chain, the damage would reach far beyond one prince. The king lowered himself into the chair without speaking. An aide standing nearby asked whether William should be summoned immediately, but Charles gave no answer. He removed his glasses, pressed 2 fingers against his forehead, and looked toward the empty chair opposite him, the same place Harry had once occupied during private family conversations. The pain was no longer abstract. His younger son's long struggle with the institution had now become entangled with documents capable of wounding the crown itself. Then the details became worse. The exposed file contained altered dates, copied royal annotations, and a disputed signature attached to material supposedly supporting Harry's succession-related claim. Charles read one passage slowly, stopped, and went back to the beginning. Someone had not simply invented a story. Someone had tried to make that story look official. The sealed appendix changed everything. A sealed appendix, a restricted section attached to a judgment because it contained sensitive evidence, traced part of the forged paperwork back to a private palace communication. That single finding pulled the danger closer to home. It suggested that whoever constructed the documents may have known language, formatting, or correspondence that was never meant to leave royal control. Charles now faced a frightening question. Had Harry been deceived? Had he knowingly relied on false material? Or had someone inside the wider royal circle helped create the illusion? Charles finally looked up. He told the aide to summon William, but before the man reached the door, the king stopped him with one final instruction. "Bring me Harry's original file first." The judgment had exposed the documents, but Charles still needed to understand the man behind the claim. And that meant confronting the fractured relationship between a father, 2 sons, and a crown that could no longer protect them from one another. William entered expecting a constitutional crisis. Instead, he found a father who looked wounded. Charles pushed the file across the table without explanation, and for several seconds the future king simply stared at Harry's name. Nothing needed to be said. Whatever rivalry had existed between the brothers had suddenly become secondary to something much more dangerous. A question of whether private resentment had been transformed into documents capable of challenging the monarchy's most protected order. William opened the folder carefully and forced himself to read. As heir, the person first in line to inherit the crown, his position depended on a lawful succession order that could not be rewritten through private wishes or manufactured records. That was why the forged papers mattered, even if the claim itself ultimately failed. Once doubt entered the documents protecting continuity, the damage could spread beyond Harry, beyond Charles, and into public trust in the monarchy itself. Charles watched his eldest son reach one disputed page and stop. The prince read it twice, then asked quietly, "Did Harry submit this himself?" The king did not answer. He could not. That silence told William something worse than a denial would have. His father still did not know how deeply the younger prince had been involved. Charles wanted proof before judgment. William feared that a father's hesitation could become a sovereign's weakness. The distance between the brothers suddenly felt heavier. Harry had spent years speaking about his frustration with royal life, while William had remained inside the institution, carrying obligations his younger brother had rejected. Yet this was no longer simply about resentment between two sons. Charles understood that painful family history had now crossed into constitutional territory, and once that line was crossed, even old conversations could become dangerous evidence. William began closing the folder, then froze. Beside his own name sat a handwritten notation he had not noticed before. He opened the file again and leaned closer. The wording surrounding it sounded strangely familiar. It echoed phrases from an old palace briefing, an internal explanation prepared for senior royals and advisors, language never intended to become part of any private succession argument. Charles saw his expression change immediately. The prince pointed to the passage and asked where it had come from. The king remembered the wording too. Worse, the same page referenced a private conversation Harry had once held with his father about his future standing inside the royal family. That exchange had never been meant for outsiders, yet pieces of it now seemed woven into an altered document. Charles finally remembered when everything had begun. Harry had once challenged him directly, asking whether the succession system had treated him fairly, and whether William's future had always mattered more than his own. At the time, the king had dismissed the anger as another painful family dispute. Now those words were sitting inside a forged claim. To understand why those pages ever existed, the family would have to return to that private confrontation. The moment Harry's frustration hardened into a grievance, nobody inside the palace managed to extinguish. The crisis had not begun in a courtroom. It had begun behind a closed door, with Harry standing across from Charles and asking a question neither man would forget. Why, he demanded, should his future diminish simply because William had been born first? Charles tried to answer as a father. Harry heard the answer as a prince. That distinction became the wound beneath everything that followed. And one particular meeting turned private resentment into something far more dangerous. Harry had spent years living beside a future he could never inherit. Succession, the legal order deciding who comes to the throne, was determined by law and birth order, not affection, frustration, or parental choice. Charles could not simply move his younger son ahead, even if he wanted to soften the emotional distance between the brothers. William would remain first in line. Harry knew that. What he struggled to accept was how often that fact seemed to shape everything else around him. The Windsor meeting became the breaking point. After a bitter dispute over ceremonial planning, Harry asked Charles for something far more serious than reassurance. He wanted a written promise that his children's royal standing would never be weakened by future palace restructuring. The king understood exactly why the request mattered. Titles, protection, official roles, and future relevance had become symbols of whether Harry's branch of the family still belonged. But Charles also knew he could not bind future sovereigns with a private promise. Harry pushed harder. He wanted certainty. Charles refused. The king explained that no father, not even a monarch, could guarantee how future reigns would handle every royal role. That answer landed badly. Harry heard another version of the same message he believed had followed him for years. William's future was protected, while his own could always be reduced. Charles remembered the chair scraping backward as Harry stood. The younger prince reached the door, stopped, and looked back. "One day," he said quietly, "the palace will regret refusing to put its promises in writing." Then he left. Charles remained where he was, convinced the anger would eventually cool. It did not. Weeks later, a draft memorandum appeared inside Harry's private correspondence. A memorandum, a written internal record of a decision or discussion, seemed to transform Charles's refusal into something dangerously different. The wording suggested conditional approval, as though the king had accepted part of Harry's demand, but left the details unresolved. Years later, investigators would discover that the same twisted language appeared inside the forged succession packet. Then came the notation that changed the inquiry. A senior royal clerk was named beside the altered passage, making the draft appear authentic. But in a documented account given during the investigation, the clerk insisted he had never written the notation, never approved the language, and had never even seen that version of the page. Charles now understood what had happened. The old family argument had not simply been remembered. It had been rebuilt into evidence. Years later, those words returned with brutal force. And when Harry finally came face to face with his father, after the judgment, neither man could pretend they were arguing only about paperwork. Harry walked into the room, knowing Charles had seen everything. No advisors sat between them. No secretary took notes. For once, there was nowhere for royal procedure to hide the damage. The king placed a copy of the disputed document on the table and asked one question. "Did you know this was false?" Harry did not answer immediately. That silence lasted only seconds. But for Charles it carried the weight of every argument, departure, accusation, and broken promise between them. Charles kept his eyes on his son. The meeting had come after the court judgment, but before the palace finalized its public response, which meant Harry's answer could shape both a family decision and an institutional one. The king was not deciding criminal guilt. His immediate concern was simpler and more painful. Had his son knowingly relied on falsified succession material, and had someone used private royal records to make those papers look real? Harry finally spoke. He said he believed parts of the file reflected genuine assurances made years earlier. He insisted the wording sounded familiar, because it echoed promises he thought had been discussed privately. Charles did not accept that explanation. He asked why anger toward the institution had been allowed to replace the most basic question of all. Where had the documents actually come from? Harry's restraint broke. He told his father that whenever duty and family had collided, the crown had always won. Charles listened, then answered with brutal calm. Pain did not give anyone the right to reshape history. Disappointment did not turn a private conversation into lawful authority. And whatever Harry believed had been denied to him, false records could never become the answer. The room tightened further when Harry made one admission. He had seen one disputed draft before it entered the legal claim. He denied creating it, but said another individual had assured him it came from an archived palace record. An archived record, a preserved official document kept for historical or legal reference, would have carried enormous weight if genuine. Harry said he believed the source knew what he was talking about. Charles reached for another page. The judgment had already tested that story. The reference number attached to the supposed archive record did exist, but it belonged to an unrelated ceremonial document. Someone had deliberately borrowed a legitimate number and attached it to something false. The trail had been manufactured. Charles pushed the page toward Harry. The younger prince would not touch it. Then came the name. Harry identified the person who had first supplied the contested papers. Charles repeated it once, slowly, as if making sure he had heard correctly. The king turned the document over and told his son that whatever happened next, their relationship could never return to what it had been before this room. The confrontation shattered the last illusion that this could remain a private family dispute, because the name Harry gave Charles pointed toward the machinery surrounding the crown itself. William understood the danger before the briefing even finished. Forging a piece of paper was one thing. Making that paper resemble an authentic royal record required access, knowledge, and confidence. Somewhere along the path to Harry's hidden claim, someone had understood how palace documents were worded, catalogued, and circulated. As officials traced the file's construction, the scandal shifted. The question was no longer simply what Harry knew. It was who had made deception possible. William listened as the restricted briefing moved through the internal safeguards surrounding royal records. Palace correspondents, archival clerks, legal advisors, and constitutional officials each handled different kinds of material, creating barriers designed to stop private notes from being mistaken for formal authority. The Supreme Court judgment had not handed control of succession to judges. It had exposed false material attached to Harry's claim and forced the monarchy to prove which records were genuine, which had been altered, and how the two had been mixed together. The prince's anger surfaced when one official explained the method. Genuine phrases from palace correspondence had been lifted from authentic records, then placed between fabricated paragraphs. That made the false documents harder to detect, because familiar language gave invented claims the appearance of legitimacy. William set down his pen and asked the room, very slowly, exactly how many people had received copies. Charles did not answer immediately because another problem had already begun. William wanted staff with possible access removed at once, but the king resisted. Suspicion alone, he argued, could destroy innocent careers and turn a controlled inquiry into panic. The future king saw it differently. Every hour of delay risked another leak, another copy, another public question about whether the palace could even protect its own records. Then the specialists found something worse. Authentication experts identified formatting taken from an old internal template, a layout once used for restricted royal communications, but never released publicly. Whoever built the forged packet either possessed historical material or understood the archive with remarkable precision. William looked toward Charles. Neither man needed to say what that meant. The next finding pulled Harry's earlier revelation back into the center of the crisis. The person he had named did not hold direct archive authority, but appointment logs and phone records showed repeated contact with someone who did. The pattern created a possible bridge between an outsider handling the claim and an individual capable of reaching genuine palace material. Charles ordered the chain traced completely before any accusation was made. Then, an aide entered with another update. The forged claim had already traveled beyond the original legal team. William leaned back, stunned. Charles asked how far it had spread. The answer changed the scale of the disaster, because the documents had escaped the private dispute long before the king knew they existed, and now the consequences were beginning to land. Harry received the palace decision without raising his voice. That was what unsettled the people around him most. He read the statement, placed his phone beside him, and stared ahead while the implications settled. His hidden succession claim was finished. The forged documents had poisoned any remaining credibility the argument possessed, and Charles had authorized an immediate separation between disputed private submissions and every authenticated royal record. Harry had spent years fighting to control his own story. Now the documents were controlling him. Harry read the palace wording again and felt the anger rise. The monarchy had formally rejected any reliance on the forged material and ordered a full review of every record connected to the claim. His statutory place in the line of succession, the position given to him by law and birth order, had not been rewritten by those documents. What had collapsed was the private legal argument built around them. That distinction mattered, because the crown was separating Harry's lawful status from a claim now stained by false evidence. The Duke turned sharply when advisors told him that denying authorship would not erase the damage. If he had relied on material that later proved fabricated, the scandal would still follow him. Harry insisted again that he had not created the documents, but the answer no longer carried the force it once had. The question had changed from who physically forged the pages to why he had trusted them enough to use them. Charles faced his own decision at the same time. A senior advisor suggested that the king publicly condemn his son to protect the institution. He refused. But the monarch also rejected any attempt to soften the palace response. That boundary cut deeply. He would not destroy Harry in public, Yet he would not use fatherhood to shield him from consequences tied to the crown. Then the final evidence schedule arrived. Harry opened it and immediately recognized something familiar. One authentic family letter had been scanned, altered, and reused as the structural base for a forged succession assurance. The original had come from Charles during an earlier attempt at reconciliation. It had been personal, careful, and meant to repair trust between father and son. Now, parts of that letter had been twisted into language suggesting constitutional promises that had never been made. Harry held the genuine version beside the altered copy. He traced the lines with his eyes and found the inserted words sitting between his father's original sentences. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his anger disappeared. "I never wanted that letter used this way," he said quietly. The statement was preserved in a documented account prepared after the evidence review, and it marked the first real shift in his position. Harry stopped defending the claim. Instead, he asked for one thing: another private meeting with Charles, with no lawyers, aides, or royal officials in the room. For the first time since the judgment, Harry was no longer fighting to preserve his claim. He was preparing to face his father without one. Charles expected another argument. Harry arrived without a file. That alone changed the room. No legal papers were placed between them, no advisors whispered at the edge of the conversation, and no disputed royal language could speak on either man's behalf. Harry told his father he would abandon every remaining attempt to defend the succession claim built around the forged documents. Charles did not celebrate. He simply looked at his son and asked why it had taken a Supreme Court judgment to bring them here. Harry did not defend himself immediately. His decision did not erase the investigation, the forged paperwork, or any legal consequences still surrounding the case. It only ended his personal effort to sustain the disputed claim. Charles made one point painfully clear: constitutional succession, the lawful order determining who inherits the crown, could never become a weapon for settling private wounds. The king had spent years separating family from duty. Now he was admitting how badly those worlds had collided. Harry finally spoke about William. He admitted that resentment toward his brother and the institution had made certain documents easier to believe, because they seemed to confirm what he already felt. He had convinced himself that his importance had been deliberately reduced, while the future king's position had always been protected. Charles listened without interrupting. For once, the anger did not control the conversation. Then the king answered with something Harry had rarely heard from him. Charles admitted his own failures as a father. Royal duty had given him endless reasons to postpone painful conversations, and every delay had allowed frustration to harden. He had believed silence would calm old wounds. Instead, silence had allowed those wounds to become certainty. Harry looked at the disputed file on the table. He told his father he had not forged the documents, but accepted that he should have challenged their origin before allowing them to support his claim. The admission was later preserved in a documented account of the private meeting, and it marked the clearest break from his earlier defensive position. Charles then revealed what the Palace Review had uncovered. Investigators had isolated the internal breach, and the individual responsible for supplying genuine templates had been removed from access pending formal proceedings. An internal breach meant unauthorized access to protected royal material, and this one had given the forged papers their dangerous appearance of authenticity. Harry understood what that meant. The deception had not been imagined, but neither had his responsibility disappeared. Harry reached toward the file, closed it, and pushed it away. Charles did not push it back. Father and son then agreed on one final act. The king would address the monarchy and reaffirm the integrity of the lawful succession record. Harry would issue a statement accepting responsibility for relying on material he had failed to authenticate. Their private battle had finally changed direction, but the reckoning could not remain behind palace doors. The next morning, the country woke to the scandal in enormous black headlines. By dawn, the family's private collapse belonged to the country. Newspapers turned Harry's hidden claim into banner headlines. Broadcasters dissected the court's findings, sentence by sentence. Outside Buckingham Palace, tourists stopped beside television crews while royal supporters argued about betrayal, responsibility, and whether Charles had protected his son for too long. Yet one image captured the entire crisis better than the shouting. The king leaving for official duties, hours after learning that his own family correspondence had been altered. Charles knew the palace statement had to calm more than one fear. It affirmed that authenticated succession records, the verified documents confirming the lawful order of inheritance, remained intact and separate from the forged material exposed by the judgment. That distinction mattered, because the public was no longer debating only Harry's judgment. People were asking how sensitive royal language had been accessed, copied, and manipulated closely enough to resemble official authority. William backed the response, but refused to treat it as a victory. Advisors spoke about stability, containment, and the strength of the crown's records. The prince stopped them. There was nothing triumphant, he said, about watching his father carry the scandal publicly while his brother's name dominated every headline. Charles heard about the remark later and understood what William meant. The monarchy had protected its legal position, but the family had paid for that protection in humiliation. Then television made the damage impossible to ignore. One broadcaster displayed portions of Charles's authentic letter beside the manipulated version. The differences were simple enough for millions to understand instantly. Genuine family language had been preserved in places, while invented assurances had been inserted between real sentences. What had sounded complicated inside court filings suddenly became painfully clear. Harry's response arrived soon after. In a documented public statement, he accepted responsibility for failing to verify the material before relying on it. He withdrew the hidden claim completely and stated that forged documents must never be used to challenge lawful succession arrangements. The words did not erase what had happened, but they ended the argument he had once fought to preserve. Outside a London newsstand, one fictional front page reduced the entire crisis to 4 brutal words: false claim, broken family. Near Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered behind barriers as the king's convoy approached. Conversations continued until the vehicles drew close. Then, for several seconds, the noise faded. Charles passed through that silence knowing exactly what it meant. The country had seen the documents. Now it was watching the father. William understood the same thing. Harry had withdrawn. The false record had been rejected. The constitutional question was settled. But one decision remained. The public argument would rage for days. But inside the palace, the legal crisis was already over, and Charles now had to decide what this disaster would mean for his family, his sons, and the emotional legacy of his reign. Charles returned to the same table where the judgment had first been placed before him. This time, the forged documents were gone. The authenticated records remained. Harry had withdrawn the claim. William's place had never legally changed, and the palace had sealed the breach that allowed genuine royal material to be exploited. Constitutionally, the crisis was over. Personally, it had taken something from the king that no judgment could restore: the belief that family wounds could remain separate from the crown if everyone simply avoided confronting them. Charles opened the authenticated succession register and read the names in silence. The register, the verified record confirming the lawful order of inheritance, remained untouched by the forged claim. Harry's hidden argument had been withdrawn, the false documents had been formally rejected, and William's position had never changed. That mattered because the scandal had threatened trust, not the law itself. The monarchy survived because the authentic record remained stronger than the deception built around it. The king also knew survival had demanded a terrible price. The internal access breach had been contained, compromised records had been identified, and new authentication procedures were ordered to make sure private correspondence could never again masquerade as constitutional authority. Yet none of those safeguards could repair what had happened between father and son. Charles had refused to rescue Harry from the consequences of trusting falsified material, and that decision had protected the crown while deepening his grief as a parent. William understood the contradiction better than anyone. The future king had emerged constitutionally secure, but he refused to treat that as victory. In private conversations recorded by palace staff, he made clear that he would not publicly condemn Harry or turn the scandal into a personal triumph. Instead, he stayed close to Charles, knowing his father had preserved the institution only by accepting another fracture inside the family. Harry had also reached his final position. In his documented public statement, he accepted responsibility for advancing a claim supported by documents he had failed to authenticate, while maintaining that he had not personally created the forgeries. The admission ended the fight, but it did not restore trust. Some wounds had become too deep for one statement to close. Charles finally understood the deeper truth. The scandal had never really been about whether Harry could overtake William. He could not. The lawful order had never shifted. The real destruction came from years of rivalry, silence, resentment, and postponed conversations becoming vulnerable to manipulation. The king closed the succession register and rested his hand on its cover. Then he gave one final instruction. Harry's genuine personal letter was to be returned to his private correspondence, not kept among the scandal files. There would be no triumphant winner. Harry lost the claim. William kept what the law had always given him. Charles preserved the crown. But the king emerged knowing that a monarchy can defend succession with law, records, and judgment. Yet no institution on earth can rewrite the damage already done between a father and his sons. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.